Recently, there's been a lot of talk about content creators taking responsibility for their past works. The biggest name here, of course, is iDubbbz, who came out and apologized for their previous videos that had racial slurs, among other things, in them. So he wanted to take responsibility and came out, made an apology video. I don't specifically want to talk about iDubbbz, but there was another content creator recently who made a tweet that caught my attention, and I have been thinking about it for the past week or so since that tweet dropped, so I wanted to talk about it here, and that is this tweet by Chris Ray Gun. Before I get to the tweet, I do want to explain to you who Chris Ray Gun is, because he's not as big as, say, iDubbbz, so you may have heard of iDubbbz, but don't know who the hell Chris Ray Gun is, and that's fine. Chris Ray Gun was someone who made anti-SJW content probably starting around the 2015 time period, and I think he stopped roughly around 2017. That's going to become a thing we will talk about in a bit. But his content mostly, again, targeted, colorful hair SJWs who call people out for their bigoted positions is mainly what his complaints were. And he had these videos, his most famous series of which was, I think that it was called SJW the Musical. And what he did was he took popular songs and then parodied them to attack SJWs.
Oh, there ain't no rest for the trigger. Where is the displease? We've got it.
Now, again, he stopped doing this kind of content around 2017 and just sort of moved on to a certain extent. Of course, talking about his past briefly here and there throughout. But what happened recently wasn't even something that was directed at him, but another content creator who he is friends with, someone named Shoe on Head. Shoe on Head is also one of the people like Chris Ray Gun who created anti-SJW content for a long time. And, I don't think it has necessarily stopped with her. I think as well that she dabbles in some forms of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ conspiracy theories. She was famous in popularizing the, kids at drag queen story times events, and also connecting Balenciaga to some sort of pedophile cult or something. Why Shoe on Head is relevant here is because Shoe on Head blocked someone else named Elise on Twitter. And so Elise responded to the block by saying, "Y'all, I'm actually so hype. This is hilarious. This woman indoctrinated me as a minor into being an anti-SJW. I watched her content as a child and became further bigoted than I already was from my environment. She probably had this effect on thousands of children." This is when Chris Ray Gun decided to show up, and he responded to Elise by saying, "How is it that me and my friends watched the edgiest shit possible growing up and entered adulthood without a seething disdain for black people or a hatred of gays? Could it be that personal responsibility plays a huge part in the things we think and believe?" My first thought when I originally read that tweet was that Chris was making some argument here about bigotry being innate, or some kind of, I guess, you're born bigoted, and that nothing Chris says had an effect on anyone, and that he shouldn't be held responsible for anything, which is amazing, since he's talking about other people taking personal responsibility, and here he is seemingly downplaying whatever kind of effect his content could have, which I would ask, why then make content in the first place if it has absolutely no effect on people? However, he did respond to his own tweet, and I think my initial take is not entirely accurate. So his response to his own tweet was, "It's weird how many people outwardly say, 'Yeah, I was a raging anti-Semite, but in my defense, I watched some YouTubers once,' and expect that to be a sufficient reason." Now, my sense of what Chris is trying to say here, even though not well, is that the environment sure can play a role, but people do need to some extent, take responsibility for their views, right? You can't just solely blame it on the environment. There is something about you that you need to work on and fix. But if that's the case, Elise's original tweet already sort of spelled that out. Because what they wrote was that it wasn't that Shoe on Head's content was the sole thing that radicalized them, but it was part of an environment that helped further radicalize them, which is an important caveat and something that Chris Raygun, in his quick to tweet out response, doesn't capture. But this leaves us with an interesting sort of question, which is that, yes, of course, the environment matters. It does, growing up in a certain culture really does affect the things that you believe. But also, we need to acknowledge some form of personal responsibility. I don't think it should be the be-all, end-all. I think, personal responsibility rhetoric is often utilized by conservatives to blame people for what are systemic issues. But acknowledging that people need to change their behaviors and become better, especially people who engage in racist behaviors, I don't think is an incorrect approach to, people being bigoted. My issue, though, with Chris's tweet then is how this sort of also tries to remove blame from him. It isn't just that, the other person should take responsibility for their stuff. The environment still exists. He still contributed to others' radicalization. Shouldn't he also take personal responsibility for the crap that he created? And here is a video clip from a recent live stream that he did where he sort of explains why he doesn't think like he should take personal responsibility.
The thing that I've never, and I made a video about this ages ago, and I actually watched it again recently, and I still agree with like literally everything I said. It's like the thing that bothers me about the pipeline conversation isn't that it isn't a valid conversation to have or that it isn't real, but like where people are willing to draw the line so as to be convenient for the things that they value. So like you could say, if you're 15 years old, you're watching a YouTube video about how Ghostbusters 2016 is kind of cringe, and you come away with that from that video, and you're like, wow, yeah, Ghostbusters is really cringe. I hate black people now.
Like, huh?
So, okay, let's say that that's you. And then you immediately are like, okay, that is what you believe. Fascinating. Immediately you have to ask yourself, like, why did I think that? And then immediately the uncomfortable truth of how malleable and how susceptible you are to propaganda rears its ugly head. Because if you're willing to take that message away from something that's completely innocuous, then Lord knows what the fuck you're going to fall for in the future. And you don't want to admit that about yourself. That's not something that's comfortable to admit. So instead, you pass it on to the next person. But the next person, the next person's just a person. It's just a content creator. Like, why is it my fault that the algorithm is fucked and not YouTube's fault, for example? Like, why does the buck stop with me and not with YouTube? The reality is because YouTube doesn't have a fucking face.
Target.
YouTube doesn't have a person. YouTube isn't an individual that you can graft onto. YouTube is an amorphous blob, and you feel powerless against it. So you draw the line.
People have been
really,
to take shots at YouTube, and it hasn't done anything.
Well, you just draw the line quickly. Yeah. Is what it is. It's like, because that's where it's convenient. Where it's like, it reeks to me of just a convenient, like, who's guilty hot potato. Where like, oh, it's not me, it's this person. And then it's like, no, it's not me, it's the algorithm. And then, I don't know, if somebody gets bullied, right? And then they beat up a kid at school, whose fault is it? Whose fault is that?
Well, I would say that, there is a degree of blame to go around for everyone.
The
kid who actually did the beating is the one being held responsible.
Yeah, right. But what I'm saying is, like, okay, it's like the bully beat up a kid at school. All right. So it's the bully's fault. And it's like, well, the bully's parents are actually pretty scummy. It's like, okay, so it's the bully's parents. Well, it's like, well, their parents weren't great either, obviously. And it's like, where do you draw the fucking line? Like, where do you end it? It's just dumb. The only way to get to the bottom of this shit is personal responsibility in the immediate term. When I noticed that people were like misconstruing my messages, I immediately shifted out of that space. It's why every time somebody has a complaint about me, it's fucking 7 to 8 years old. It's fucking embarrassing. Tweets from like 2016. And it's like, dude, I don't know what to tell you. What did you want? Did you want me to stop? Because I did. So
here's
maybe
another
look
thing, too.
at you. If you're believing the worst shit about random people because YouTube videos made you feel that way, look inward.
Now, I framed this video clip as him explaining why he shouldn't take personal responsibility, and maybe he would take issue with that. But there is a key line in this video where he talks about how others misconstrued his content. That is, what they were watching were what he thought were, I guess, left or liberal takes criticizing his own side, but were somehow misconstrued as being right-wing or fascist. However, if you go back and watch some of his older content, you can clearly tell, okay, that he is not being misconstrued when other people get radicalized by his content. Take, for example, a video he made parodying the song Paparazzi by Lady Gaga, which he called Punch a Nazi. In this video, he clearly spells out this position that somehow the left or Antifa were mistaking people for Nazis who weren't really Nazis.
I'm on the streets, I'm so smart, can't you see? My philosophy is if you don't constantly bitch about the president, you're a white supremacist. Meaning the frog, roll off to the gulag, listen to Showdy. My, what will the judge say? Our dynasty can't understand irony.
And in that video, he defends people like Richard Spencer and Lauren Southern, who are both Nazis. Like, people were not just misconstruing his content. He was running defense for actual Nazis who were pretty clear in their beliefs. One of the last political videos that Chris Ray Gun made for his channel was him criticizing Francesca Ramsey. Francesca herself put out a tweet thread recently, so if you want to go find more about her position, you can go check that out. The only reason I bring up this video is because in it, Chris Ray Gun mentions some of his friends, which again includes Shoe on Head, but also Sargon of Akkad and another person named Mouthy Buddha. Now, Mouthy Buddha and Sargon of Akkad, again, are fucking Nazis. Now, maybe it's the case that Chris Ray Gun is just a super naive little boy. But, like, he was friends and hanging out with people who were not covert about their beliefs. Like, what Sargon believed was out there. He loved to play this game like he wasn't really a Nazi, but he ran for, like, the far-right party in England and believes a lot of far-right bullshit. So it's not like Chris Ray Gun didn't know this. To put this in perspective, just in case we're trying to, like, figure out to what extent Chris Ray Gun knew his friends to be bigoted, he released this Francesca Ramsey criticism video a week after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. It is in this video, again, where he talks about Mouthy Buddha and Sargon of Akkad. And if you don't realize, like, why all of this is absurd, Sargon of Akkad, at this point in time, was also sitting down with people like Millennial Woes, another avowed fascist, where Sargon of Akkad and Millennial Woes openly mocked Heather Heyer and tried to deflect whether or not the Unite the Right participants actually contributed to her murder. And Chris Ray Gun is out here calling Sargon a friend.
And then VidCon arrives, where we all finally met in person. Sargon, Blair, Shoe, Skeptic, Vernaculus, me. Nearly everyone was there, and it was fucking awesome.
I also want to say, in that punching a Nazi video, he also was making fun of Antifa as, I guess, being more genderqueer. And again, if Chris wants to come out here and pretend like he was always pro-gay, like the butt of that joke is literally just, ha ha, look at these effeminate male Antifa members, which is inherently homophobic. So Chris is reacting to everybody reacting to his Twitter comment here. And his response is like, you're all just like, I'm a face that you can easily latch onto and criticize, when really it was the algorithm's fault. But there was a reason why the algorithm latched onto his content. It wasn't just that YouTube was sending people to the far right stuff from his video sort of like coincidentally. It was that he was networking with those people. He was friends with those people. They made content with each other. So of course the algorithm thinks if you like Chris Ray Gun, you're gonna like Sargon of Akkad, you're gonna like Lauren Southern, you're gonna like Mouthy Buddha, etc., etc. People weren't just misconstruing his content. It was clearly homophobic. It was clearly fascist in nature. Now, if he does not stand by that, rather than criticize other people who got radicalized further by his content for not taking a sufficient amount of personal responsibility, maybe Chris should look inward.
Look inward.